Welcome to our third pre-class lecture. This is the last one for a while. I don't have any for next week. So next week we'll just do stuff in class. But this one we're going to talk about gender determination. We'll talk about how different organisms do gender determination, and we'll talk about what happens when that doesn't go quite as expected. So if we first start off, you guys all know, I think you all know, that humans have an X and a Y chromosome. The Y is smaller than the X, and the X and XY individual is normally a male, but not always. And an XX individual is normally a female. There are some exceptions to that called intersex, and we'll talk about those in a minute, where the person can have characteristics of both males and females. So if we look at fruit flies have been in model organisms in genetics for a long time. In fruit flies, XX like us, XX is normally female, XY is normally male. But if you have an egg that's fertilized and for some reason it doesn't have a Y chromosome, it will become a sterile male. So there's nothing really special about the Y in that case. The Y doesn't determine the gender of the organism, but the Y has some fertility factor that allows a male to become to have children, to have baby fruit flies, which they do a lot. And actually, when they played around with the genetics of fruit flies even further, they found that it's really the ratio of the X chromosomes to the autosomes that determine the sex. If you've got more than one X, it's normally a female for every set of autosome. If you've got less than 0.5, it's male. If it's between 0.5 and 1, it's got mixed characteristics. Don't worry about this, but why I put this in here is because you realize that we can play around with these fruit flies using genetic techniques and kind of figure out exactly what's going on by playing with the number of X chromosomes versus number of autosomes. Flies and other insects can have what are called gynandromorphs, gyn meaning the female, andro meaning the males. And what these are flies or butterflies or other things that have characteristics of both males and females. This is actually a moth. So flies and moths and other organisms. And basically what's happened in these organisms is that they started off as an XX. But sometime during the course of mitosis, they lost one of the X's in one of the cells that resulted from a mitosis. And after that, all of the cells that resulted from that cell only had one X chromosome. Those cells have male characteristics, and because they only have one X chromosome, they display whatever genes are on that X chromosome. So the fly on the left here has 2 X chromosomes on the left side and only one on the right side. On one of those X chromosomes, it has dominant wild-type genes, wild-type meaning normal genes, and it displays normal characteristics. The other X chromosome has some mutations, so that eosin I basically is a different colored eye, that miniature wing is a smaller wing. Those mutations you can see displayed on the right side because the X that was maintained in those cells is the X that had those recessive mutant genes. And it no longer has the X with the wild type genes or the normal genes to dominantly mask the expression of those recessive genes. So that you can see a different phenotype on both sides, but there's female characteristics on the left and male characteristics on the right as well. On the right here is a moth, and I don't remember which side is male and which side is female, but you can see definite difference in coloring. One side is colored like the female would normally be colored. The other side is colored like the male would be colored. And that again is one side has an XO and the other side has an XX. So birds and butterflies and some reptiles have a different system of sex or gender determination. And what this is basically the female has the equivalent of the X and the Y. We call this in this case a Z and a W, just to distinguish them from the X and the Y. They don't look like a Z or a W, and the X and the Y don't look like an X or a Y. But we do the Z and the W to basically denote that one's bigger and one's smaller. In this case, the male has the two similar chromosomes, equivalent to the X and the X, but now it's Z and Z. And it's the female egg that determine which sex the embryo and the future bird or other organism, what gender that organism will be. So if the female puts in a Z chromosome, that new organism will be a female. If she puts in a W chromosome, that new organism will be a male. In bees and honeybees and some wasps, there is something that's called the haplodiplo method of sex determination. The queen is a diploid organism. The queen has two copies of every allele, for that gene, and each of her chromosomes is doubled. Okay, she will produce eggs. The eggs are haploid. If an egg just develops into an organism without being fertilized, that becomes a drone male bee. If the egg is fertilized by a male, that becomes a worker bee and it's female. Some of those worker bees can become a queen, but the way that you become a queen is being fed special jelly when you're just a developing bee. And that will allow you to develop into a bigger bee, which can then become the queen. So the queen isn't really any different than a worker bee. She just gets specialized nutrients, which then make her bigger and stronger and able to defend a hive. Okay, as we said before, in humans, XX is females and XY is males. But there are some variations on this. And so we'll talk about what happens when you have a lot of variations. So one of the things that can happen is that you can have multiple numbers of X's and multiple numbers of Y. This comes about because of non-disjunction during meiosis, where basically an egg may have two X's in it, for example, or a sperm may have two X's or two Y's, or any variations of that, an X and a Y, for example. And when that happens and you get a fertilized egg, that egg may have a variable number of X's and Y's. We don't have a lot of tolerance to having extra chromosomes, but we have a lot of tolerance for having X's and Y's, and I'll explain why that is in class. Okay, so one example of this is Klinefelter syndrome. And I used to know somebody with Klinefelter syndrome, a really, really wonderful man. He was very, very tall, very gentle, very nice, mentally retarded, but a very sweet guy. Klinefelter syndrome basically is somebody that's XXY. And, but it could be even XXXY. So you can have multiple copies of X's beyond just two. So, but most people are XXY. People that are XXY will have sterility. They won't have normal ability to sexually reproduce, but they will have male genitalia. So physically they look like males and they're considered to be males. But as they develop into adulthood in teenage years, they will develop some secondary characteristics that are more characteristic of females. So you may end up with breast development, for example. So you'll get some characteristics that are associated with females. You can have multiple X's in this case. People with Klinefelters also tend to be a little bit mentally retarded. I'm not sure why that is, but extra copies of the X chromosome likely is not a good situation because you get extra genes at that point, and even though we'll silence a lot of those genes, they still have some consequences on the person. There is another form of disease called Jacob syndrome, which is XYY. And you could have multiple numbers of Ys in that case. It doesn't seem to, because the Y chromosomes are so small, XYY doesn't seem to have a lot of extra characteristics. It doesn't seem to really have, I mean, you could probably live with an XYY and not know that you have it unless you have some reason to have your genetic code sequenced, or somebody looks at your karyotype, for example. So XYY might be more common than we think. In females, there are some triple X females. And so XXX, not dirty in this case, or not, a highly potent alcohol. XXX, 3 copies of the X chromosome. Normally, they're again mostly normal. You might not even know that you have this. What generally happens is we inactivate any extra chromosomes, extra X chromosomes. We'll talk about that later. So mostly what these people will have is just an extra inactivated form of the X. They may have slightly reduced fertility. They may have a slight mental retardation, but it might not even be noticeable. And again, you might not know that you have this unless you've had your genes sequenced, or you've had a reason to go into the doctor for fertility treatments and they look at your genetic code. You can also have a monosomy. So monosomy meaning only one copy. And the Y is so small that you really can't have only one copy of the Y. That's not going to allow you to exist. But you can end up with one copy of X, and that's called Turner syndrome. I've known 2 women with Turner syndrome, and again, really wonderful women. Phenotypically, they're female. They tend to be a little shorter than normal. They tend to be fairly sterile. If they're going to have kids, they need to have them early because they only produce a limited number of eggs. And so unless you have your children at a very young age, like in your early 20s or late teens, you're probably not going to be able to have children. They are usually they usually have good mental ability. They're not mentally retarded like some of the other syndromes, but they will have some slight differences in stature and slight differences in their characteristics. Okay, so all of these are basically examples of changes in your system coming from multiple X's and multiple Y's. Within your X and Y chromosome, it's really not that much on the Y that determines whether or not you're a male. Your X chromosome doesn't really have a role to play at all in this, but the Y chromosome has a gene that's called XRY. And XRY basically is a gene that encodes what's called the testes determining factor, which is the factor that will allow you to have testes and develop as a male. And we know that this is the thing that makes you develop as a male, because if you're a person that has an X and a Y, but you're missing that particular gene, you develop as a female and you develop as a normal female. And again, you probably wouldn't even know that you had this unless you had some sort of genetic reason to have your genes sequenced and you realize that you have an X and a Y. Okay. You could also be an XX male and a pretty normal XX male if that SRY gene got transposed and went on to the X chromosome. Okay, so if you had a transposition where that gene basically ended up on the X chromosome and you inherited 2 X's, you would be a normal male, pretty much normal. Again, you might not even know that you have this, but you would have actually physically 2 X's. So that would be an interesting situation, right? You might not know that you have this. This is one of the things that is a surprise sometimes if you go to a company like 23andMe and you have your genes sequenced, and you might find out that maybe you don't have an X and an X. Maybe you're a female with a XY, or maybe you're a male with an XX. Okay, so there are a lot of conditions where people don't have exactly the normal genitalia or the dimorphic in their genital organs. In other words, they have some characteristics of males and some characteristics of females. And some of the things that we talked about just a minute ago, like Klinefelters, might fall under this, depending on how you define this. But this is a condition that's called intersex. And intersex people can live really normal lives, but they have difficulty sometimes in defining whether or not they're males or females. You know, they've had this mix of characteristics. They have to decide which gender they want to be considered part of. And for some of them, it's not, you know, they're kind of in the middle someplace. So intersex is kind of it's a biological condition that's been around forever, obviously. But I think now we have a lot of people that are trying to figure out how to live with that condition. These can consist of things like an enlarged enlarged clitoris, which would look like testes, or undescended testicles, which would look like a female when that person still has testicles and maybe somewhat physically male. Some people have external testes, but inside they have at least a rudimentary ovaries and a uterus. We don't know how common this is because a lot of people don't necessarily know that they have this condition, but it's maybe as high as 1 per 1,000 births. Some of that depends on how you're defining intersex, because some people define some conditions under intersex and other conditions not. So it may be a fairly high number of people with intersex characteristics. Now, you get diagnosed with intersex sometimes at birth. Sometimes at birth, the doctors will realize that this person has maybe both external testes, but also other parts, internal genital organs, or you might have undescended testicles that eventually descend. So you might get diagnosed with this at birth. Sometimes at birth, there are surgeries that are done to basically define somebody as one gender or another. So they'll remove tissue or they'll add tissues in order to basically more fully define somebody as, to a certain gender. Sometimes people don't know that they're intersex until they get to be teenagers, and their secondary sex characteristics don't develop as normal. They may end up with secondary sex characteristics from the other sex, the other gender. Sometimes people get it defined as intersex when they realize that they're not fully fertile. And so they might at that point realize that they don't have, even though they have always considered themselves to be of one gender, they may have rudimentary genital organs that are not fully normal, and therefore they can't have children or they'll have reduced fertility. Sometimes people don't even know that they have this until maybe they have some sort of a genetic test done, probably for other reasons, maybe just for fun, and then they realize that they have characteristics that they didn't expect. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the things, some of the syndromes that might be considered to be intersex. So in humans, an XY person is normally male, but again, you have to have that SRY gene. And then beyond that, the male sex is further determined by the production of testosterone. And the testosterone has to be detected by androgen receptors in order to develop male secondary sex characteristics. So one of the most common forms of intersex is what's called androgen insensitivity syndrome. And there's a good number of women that have this. What this is they are XY, they have the SRY gene, but they have no ability to detect testosterone. Their androgen receptors are not developed, they're mutated. So the genes that produce them are mutated. So they will end up with female secondary sex characteristics, and because they don't have any ovaries, they will usually consider themselves to be females, but they are sterile. And again, a lot of women won't know that they have this syndrome until they try to have children and they realize that they are sterile. There are two syndromes that basically are mutations in the same gene. So Denz-Drass and Fraser syndromes are both mutations in a gene that's called the Wilms tumor gene. It's a transcription factor that's both involved in kidney development and in testes development. So what happens here is that you will both have, if you have mutations in this gene, you will probably both have problems with kidney tumors or kidney failure, but you will also have problems with testes development. Females are pretty normal in terms of their sex and their gender determination. So if you're XX and you have a problem with the Wilms tumor gene, you will just have problems with your kidneys, but not problems with your genitalia. Males are infertile, and they might be defined as females because they have undescended testes. So they might be categorized as females at birth because their testes won't be seen. Another form of intersex is 5-alpha reductase deficiency. And 5-alpha reductase is a enzyme that processes testosterone. So it's a defect in this particular gene, which basically makes the enzyme that allows for testosterone to be produced. These are going to be XY, but they will look like females. But then what happens is, so they're often raised as females, and they may, again, not even know that they were originally, that they have the sexual chromosomes to be a male, and that they have the SRY genes and the sexual chromosomes to be a male because they're not processing testosterone. But what happens when they get to be teenagers and adults is they will often develop some male characteristics. So that may then basically their undescended testicles may become enlarged, and they will then descend, and you'll realize that they had testes all along. They may end up with male facial body hair. So what happens to these women is surprise, they get to be teenagers, and then they realize that they had some of the sexual characteristics of males. They're usually not fertile, but they're raised as females, and then as teenagers, they have to figure out whether they want to be considered to be males, whether they want to remain as females, or whether they want to just consider themselves to be intersex and not define themselves by either gender. A different form of intersex is called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And basically what this is an XX, so a female, who has production of a lot of androgens. So on the adrenal gland, there's an overgrowth, and that overgrowth basically leads to high secretion of testosterone. And they'll have normal female anatomy, but they'll have a large clitoris that will look a little bit like testicles. And they may end up with excessive body hair and excessive facial hair, maybe a deep voice. There's a famous runner, I can't think of her name right now, but there's a famous runner who has this, who runs as a female, but she does have the secondary sex characteristics of a male. So that's it. That's all we need to talk about right now. So I'm going to process this and put it up online. And then when you get to class, you can ask questions about it. And then we will talk about X-linked inheritance as well. So thank you for watching my little movie. I will see you in class.